Hey guys, it's Courtney. Today I'm going to be sharing with you 3 cards I created using the Blossoming stamp set, and this is part of the Fresh Bloom release by Simon Says Stamp. I'm going to be using 3 different coloring mediums here for each of my cards. So for the first one, I'm going to start off with a piece of tone gray paper, and this is by Strathmore. This is great for colored pencils. I'm going to be using my polychromos today. And I'm bringing out my Misty because number one, I'm definitely going to want to stamp this more than once so that you guys can see the ink. And also, this is a huge image. As you can see, it pretty much takes up the entire card. This panel is cut down slightly smaller than an A2 size card. I think this was 5 1/4 by 4. And just so that you guys can see the ink, I am going to stamp this more than once. Also keep in mind that this ink does fade back a little bit as it sits on the paper. So sometimes it's best to stamp it at least twice so that when it does fade, you can still see those lines. So we're going to jump right into the coloring, and I'm not going to show you all of the coloring here. I am going to start off with my darkest color, and where these little areas of the tree trunk and branches kind of, they're like little indentations. They're not really holes in the tree, but they kind of look like holes, I guess. But I'm going in with a very heavy hand with my darkest color. That way, when I do the rest of the coloring, these areas will not blend out because I went in with such a heavy hand. And I was going to lose them. So once I started my coloring, because I used the fade out ink, I wouldn't be able to see my lines anymore. So I wanted to make sure I did this first. So for the branches and the tree trunk, I'm working in different sections here, and I'm not going to show you the entire thing, but you can see the color combinations that I used and how I did the shading. So I started off with this first little section here, just going in with a very light hand with my lightest color first, and then went to my darkest and kind of worked my way down. I'm concentrating my shading mainly on the left-hand side and where the tree branch kind of, if there's like any indentations, I may put a little bit of a flick there or a little U shape or a V shape to kind of go with the shape of the branch. And there's Frankie. And this will only last a second. He ends up getting kicked out. And then going back in with my lightest color. Now, the lightest color is kind of like a golden yellow, but once all the coloring was done, you can't really tell that it's more of a yellow rather than a brown. It kind of blends in with those browns that I used pretty nicely. So you can see that, I don't know whether you guys can see, but in between where the bunches of flowers are, there are little pieces of the branches that are kind of sticking out. Now, I didn't necessarily see all of these the first time around, so there's going to be a lot of different areas of this particular image that I have to keep going back to, including some of the branches, some of the leaves and flowers as well. It's just kind of hard to see everything that you have here because it is such an intricate image, but it's so much fun to color because you can color it with anything. So for this section of the branch, I'm using the same color combination. I'm just, because it's a little bit thicker, I'm just adding a little bit more of each of those colors. I pretty much stick to just a little bit of the highlight and a little bit of the darkest color, but for the midtones, I do extend those out just a little bit further than I did before. And I colored in the entire tree trunk and branches the same way, same color combination. Move on to the leaves and the flowers, and I tried to work in different sections for this as well, just because if you looked at it as a whole, it's a little overwhelming because there's so many leaves scattered about, so many flowers. I'm going right in with the darkest color for the leaves because they're so tiny, and because they're so tiny, I did not need to use more than 2 colors here, but it's just habit to at least pull out 4, especially with colored pencils, but you can definitely get away with 2 here, just as long as you have a little bit of contrast. So when I worked with the little bunches of flowers and leaves here, I tried to pick out my leaves first. Like I said before, sometimes I did have to go back to leaves that I may have missed or just didn't see the first time around. But this way it was easier to pick out the flowers and kind of just color the leaves and the flowers, and I moved on to the next bunch and did the same thing. So for the flowers themselves, I'm going to keep these super simple as well. I'm going to take my white pencil to start, and I'm going to fill in the entire flower with a very light hand. Then I'm going to do my shading just in the very center. If you've ever seen cherry blossoms, a lot of them are just pink in the center and they kind of fade off to white. So that's what I'm going for here. But they are so tiny that you're not going to be able to get kind of a realistic look unless you're super talented, and I'm not. So I'm just doing a little bit of shading in the center and kind of working that out with my midtones, and then finish it off with the white pencil again, covering up the entire flower. So it does kind of give it the illusion that it is fading to white. It's just not a very realistic look. I'm definitely new to the colored pencils. Now there are some little buds as well, and I didn't do all that much shading on those. I pretty much stuck to just maybe one of the pinks and the white. If they're a little bit larger, I may have used two of the pinks, but it really isn't necessary. You could even leave those just completely white and still be perfectly fine. So I went around the entire tree working in different bunches just one bunch at a time, and colored in the entire image the same exact way. And next, for my sentiment, you can see that there is quite a few sentiments. Well, first I cut a piece of pink cardstock, and I'll have to link the color below because I can't think of the name of it offhand. But I cut this a little bit larger than my card panel itself. Ended up choosing one of the larger sentiments, and it's actually a quote on there. And I'm going to stamp this in the lower right hand corner with black dye ink by Simon Says Stamp. This typically will give you a really good impression. It's really good for sentiments, and it's not a pigment ink, so you don't have to wait for it to dry. So once that was done, I went ahead and adhered everything together. Now the tone gray paper is very thin. It's not a cardstock. So I used my tape runner for that in order to adhere that to the pink cardstock, just because I didn't want to get those little bubbles that you sometimes get with wet glue, which I typically use. Then I switched over to my Tombow Mono Multi Glue, and because that pink cardstock is a little bit thicker, I was safe to go ahead and adhere that to a white A2 size note card. And that is the first card. Move on to the second card, and this is even more simple. So I am going to be starting off with a piece of Canson watercolor paper here. And now this is the size of an A2 size card. And initially I was going to stamp out the entire tree. Then I turned it on its side and realized that this could be a branch. So I'm going to stamp this as if the branch is coming in from the right hand side. Going to switch over to Blackout ink by Ink on 3. This is a waterproof ink. And because I'm stamping on textured cardstock or textured paper here, you definitely want to stamp this at least twice to make sure that you get that bold black image. I also left this in my MISTI just in case I needed to stamp this again. I'm going to be doing a very messy watercolor. This is like a 5-minute card here. Going to bring out some of my Zig Clean color markers here, bringing out a couple pinks, couple browns, and one of the greens. And I'm just going to start scribbling. So taking my browns and just kind of scribbling over my tree branch here, all three colors. I'm not filling it in completely. I'm just kind of sticking to the area where the branches are, but I'm just scribbling. It is super simple, just scribbling. And I wish I would have skipped the darkest color, but I didn't, and it is what it is. For my green, I'm just going to scribble a little bit, and I'm pretty much just putting a little dot here where I see leaves. And of course, I'm probably missing some, but it will give the basic idea that there are leaves mixed in with the flowers. For the flowers, I took my darker pink and just scribbled in the little bunches of flowers all throughout the card. Same thing with the lightest pink, and again, not filling in the entire area, just putting scribbles down. And I used two different pinks, and I think once everything was done, the lighter pink wasn't really that noticeable, so you could probably skip that as well. Once that was done, I took a mister bottle and I just misted the entire card and just let the colors kind of run. And it just gives it a very messy look, but it's a very quick, very quick card, and I don't have to do any coloring on this one. I did take a dry paper towel just to kind of scoop up any of the puddles that were forming, especially on the edge of that card. See, once I sprayed it, it kind of bent, which is typical. You can tape it down, but I was just being lazy. I did trim down my panel a little bit, especially on that right-hand side where that brown was a little bit too dark and it didn't really spread out too much. Next, I'm going to go ahead and add my sentiment, and I'm going to bring out my Misty for this as well. Again, I'm working on textured paper, and it's a little bit warped from all that water that I added, so I do want to make sure that I get a very crisp impression when I do when I stamp out my sentiment. Line that up directly underneath my image there, and I will be stamping this again with that black dye ink by Simon. And I did get a pretty good impression the first time around, but I always bring out my stamp positioner when I'm working on watercolor paper because you just never know. So once that was all stamped out, I'm going to pop this up onto an A2 size note card. So I'm going to take a piece of fun foam that is cut just slightly smaller than my card panel itself. I'm going to switch over to my ATG gun, which lately I've been using a lot for fun foam, even though I do struggle with it. It just doesn't glide right for me. I don't know whether maybe I put the roll of adhesive in there wrong. I don't know. It's like I don't know, but it does stick well to the fun foam and you don't get any warping like I did with the Tombow Mono Multi Glue. So until I find a better alternative, I know the score tape and all of that is great for it. I just don't have the patience to be ripping all those little pieces of tape. So this is a lot easier and quicker for me. I went ahead and popped that onto an A2 size note card and then took some Nuvo Jewel Drops, which dry clear with just a little bit of color to them, and I'm popping on just a little teeny tiny dot onto the center of each of the larger flowers. So any of the flowers that have that little curvy line for the center, those are the ones that I'm putting this little dot of Nuvo Drops in. The other ones, like the ones that are kind of tucked behind the other flowers, I'm not going to worry about because these are such teeny tiny drops. I think this only took about 15 minutes or 20 minutes to dry completely. So you should be good with that. It's just hard to tell if they're dry because they are pretty clear. So finally, we're going to move on to the third and final card. And of course, we're going to move on to Copic Coloring. So I have a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock cut down to an A2 size note card size. And I wanted the tree to kind of be coming in from the left-hand side. So I'm not going to be stamping the entire image. Stamping again with the blackout ink by Ink on 3 because this is waterproof, but it's also Copic safe. Stamping that twice to get a very bold black impression, and we'll jump right into the coloring. So I'm going to, again, not show you all of the coloring here. If I showed you the coloring for both of these cards, we'd probably be here for about 3 hours. So I'm going to spare you that. And I'm just going to basically show you the color combinations that I used and where I put the shading. I did add a little bit more shading on the one that I colored with Copics, and that's probably just because I feel more comfortable with Copics. I'm not as comfortable with the colored pencils yet. I'm working on it. I've been practicing, but I'm just not all that comfortable with them, so I kind of stick to very basic coloring with them. So I mapped out all of my darkest areas with my lightest color first, and I'm creating shadows, again, sticking to the shading being on mainly the left-hand side. For the tree trunk, I added a little bit of shading on both sides because this would be more of a rounder object. You would still have a highlight in the center. Even if it's off to one side a little bit, you would still have that highlight. You wouldn't have the highlight all the way on one side. I also created a shadow around those little indentations or holes that are in the tree trunk. They kind of pop out a little bit, so that would create a shadow as well. Went in with my darkest color to add some of those shadow areas, but not to every shadow. So I use my darkest color pretty sparingly typically, but you can also add some shading with your darkest midtones or even any of your midtones really. You don't have to add shading with just that darkest color. I used a 5-color combination here. I don't know why I don't typically use 5 colors, but I extended all of these areas out with these midtones. going over all of those shadows areas that I had created and also adding a few more here and there, especially where the tree or the branches are kind of indented on itself. I added a little bit of shading there with like a U shape or a V shape or sometimes just a little flick. So this is the true midtone, and then we'll move on to the lightest midtone for the E33, just leaving a very small highlight on the tree trunk itself, again, in the center, just a little bit towards the right because my light source would be in the top right, so my shading would be mostly to the left. Finally going in with the E31, which is the lightest color that we had started with, and just filling in those highlight areas. Once my tree trunk and my branches were all colored, we're going to be working in little groups of these flowers again, just because it is easier. For the leaves, I'm going to go right in with my darkest color, and I'm only using a 2-color blend here. I'm putting one little flick in the center of the leaf and then blending that out with the lightest color. I didn't want to take the chance of adding too much pigment or too much ink down because I didn't want it to bleed. And these are teeny tiny areas, and even going in with a colorless blender would be difficult. So for the flowers, these are not going to have any white on them. I'm going to switch over to one of my favorite pink combinations, color them completely in with my lightest color, and then adding again my shading in the center of the flower and kind of working my way out, pretty much just creating that circle again. I'm just using the tip of my marker. These are so tiny that you, again, do not have to use 4 colors here. You can certainly use 3 or even 2 because they are so tiny. For the little buds that are kind of spraying off, I guess, I only used 2 colors here. And for the darkest color that I used in those, I just put one single teeny tiny dot just to have a little bit of contrast. But again, they're so tiny that this part is totally optional. So you can see that I missed part of this little branch over to the left-hand side, so I had to go back and grab some of those E-markers that I used for my tree trunk to fill in those areas. There was a lot of different areas that I had missed and just didn't see the first time around, but I continued coloring in all of my flowers and leaves the same way as I did with that little bunch. Now I cut this down with my largest stitched rectangle die by Simon Says Stamp. And there is another stamp. There's a couple different stamps in the stamp set that you can kind of build with. And one of them is a little swing. So I wanted to stamp that coming off of this branch right here. But I couldn't make it fit because I've already done my coloring. I couldn't make it fit around my little flowers. So I just took a little piece of Post-it note tape to make a little mask there, stamped that down, and then took an EK Success journaling pen just to extend the ropes of the swing to make it actually meet meet the rest of the tree. And I did very simple coloring with this. I did very little shading. It doesn't even have to be shaded. This is so tiny, but this will just make it a little bit different from the other cards that we had created. The stamp set also comes with a few little birds that you can add into the tree or around the tree as well. So once that was colored, I didn't bother to color in the ropes or anything, and you can see it's so tiny that I did have to go in with my colorless blender to fix my mistakes as well. So for my sentiment, I am again stamping this with that black dye ink. This seems to be my favorite ink for sentiments now. And then I used that same pink cardstock that we had used in the very first card and cut that just a little bit larger than the stitched rectangle die, layered that on to my A2 size note card with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue, which again is definitely my favorite adhesive. So that is it. That is the 3 cards that I created. The new Fresh Bloom release is available now. So if you want to head on over to the Simon Says Stamp, I will link all of the products that I used below. Thank you guys so much for stopping by and have a great day.